I'm just going to begin sharing my slides. We've got a big call today, some pretty exciting news, some pretty exciting developments. Now it's going to take perhaps another minute or two for people to dial in. So I'm going to display our antitrust policy notice as usual. We'll give people another 2 minutes and then we'll kick off the call formally.
Shane, is that you?
That is me.
Hey, it's Russ from General Motors.
Ross, great to have a chance to connect. Looking forward to our talk.
Hi, this is Miriam.
Hey, welcome back. I just saw I saw something interesting on Ross's kind of location display. Apparently the U.S. Army Tank Automotive Command is somewhere north of you. It's showing
Yep, that's true.
Oh, interesting places. If I recall correctly, at one point General Motors had a tank building business, though it was divested after a while.
Yeah, that would have been probably long before I was here. I've been here 20 years, and I think I've heard about it, but I don't think there's been anything while I've been here.
I suspect I might be reaching back into the 50s, 60s period.
Yeah, further into the archives.
Sure they were nice.
I'm sure they were. Now we've got a nice group appearing. We're going to give it another few seconds for everyone to dial in. Russ, I think this is your first OpenChain call, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah, you're right.
It's great to have you here. We're a very open community, so the idea is we'll, of course, run through our agenda, but everyone's very welcome to hop in with questions or comments at any point.
Great. And thank you for having me.
Now, it's really cool to have you here, actually. We're seeing a lot of traction in automotive. So it's been great with the automotive work group. We had 95 participants from the get-go. And one thing that we're really glad to be doing right now is building out friendships in North America, because we had good coverage in Asia. We began to build relationships in Europe, but we were lacking some good friends in the Americas, so you're extremely welcome.
Glad to be here.
Alrighty, everyone. So the antitrust policy notice has been lurking around there, as usual, before we get the call proper running. We're going to do our roll call, project update. We're going to go through some stuff for the spec work team and the conformance work team. Before I get started, I just note that essentially we are on the second last call where anyone can give input on our ISO edit version of the spec. On October 31st, we lock it down, and at that point, only critical comments will be taken. And with that in the air, let's do a quick roll call. So I'm going to list out the people I can see here. If you're a telephone number and I'm not sure who you are, I might ask. So there's myself, Shane Coughlin. We've got Alexandra here, who is the person who does all our wonderful minutes and is basically keeping everything running in the background.
Hello.
Hi, Alex. We've got Alexius, we've got Till, we've got Indira. Hi, Indira. We've got Robert Marion on the line, I believe. I'm not sure if we've had you on the line before, Robert. Welcome. We've got Jeff, who gave an excellent strategic presentation last time. We've got Katharina, Andrew, Nicole, Wendy, Gary, Nathan, David, Andreas, who is, well, where are you? Which company are you with, Andreas? I'm not quite sure.
Hi, this is Andreas. I'm with Bitsy.
Oh!
And yeah, Jeff invited us to participate. It's the first time that we are here today.
It's very cool to have you. And, you know, it's one of those things where now you're part of us. Just jump in at any point. Oh, Robert just sent a message that he couldn't unmute in time, and hello. So hi, we've got Max here, we've got Miriam, we have got Russ, we've got Ronnie, We've got Dennis Wheel is Mark Giese, head of our spec team, and I believe it's Jim Hutchinson in San Diego. I think Sammy just joined as well. So we've got people from a whole host of companies here, ranging from Qualcomm to ARM to Intel to General Motors to Software Compliance Academy to Microsoft to FOSS ID and so on. It's a big mix, all kind of people. Good to have you here. Let's dive right in. It's a busy schedule. The project update. We've had a lot of news, so instead of covering it all, I decided to really focus on the fact that our strategic target of building out in the Asian region has been turbo boosted in September. We had significant workshops in Taiwan, China, Japan, and India. And we just came off a workshop in Korea as well. So, when it came to our CJK plus I outreach, we had a stellar month. And we've had a great situation in that all of the work groups are planning their next meetings now. So we've got the momentum that we wanted in Asia, and we've now got the momentum that we can apply to the supply chain here in the coming year or so. For those of you who are new to our calls, in essence, we're becoming an ISO standard next year. So we're moving from de facto to formal standardization. We want to have nice reach into the global supply chain to make sure that suppliers, particularly suppliers who might not be deeply involved in the open source community but partake in open source, can get information, can get group support, and participate in the project as it enters ISO, as they see it more frequently in procurement and so on. To show you how cool it is, here's just a montage, which is the only way to do this properly, a montage of some of the people partaking in the events across Asia last month. It's been just brilliant, and a lot of the great stuff that's been happening here is self-driven. People are turning up to share their stories, to get information. It's a very vibrant community. And one of the things we're doing as we grow is we're trying to create an interview series which helps people onboard, so new people can really see the human face of the project. Our second interview just went live today. Both of the first interviews are from Japan, Kayoko from TubSud and Yoshiko from Fujitsu. We will naturally be expanding the interview series globally. I'm hoping to have interviews coming from Europe, United States, China, and Korea in the very near term. Certainly, as we head into Open Source Summit Europe, and as we prepare for the end-of-year Open Compliance Summit, we will be trying to make sure that we have a host of interviews and information, so as people engage with the project, they can really get a feel for the human face behind it. That's where I'm going with the project update. You can find out all of our updates on openchainproject.org/news. And there's a fairly hefty stream of stuff going on, particularly talks, particularly people in our community doing outreach, but we do have a lot of material release as well. So not just case studies, but reference material, explanations of new types of approach or services globally. We'll be covering one of those in a few minutes when we look at the Conformance contribution coming from TUVSUD and PwC Germany. That'll be after diving into our spec work team. So I guess this is the point, Mark, where I hand over to you and you let us know where we're at, and then we open to see if anyone has any comments or concerns on the spec. For those of you who are brand new, before I hand over, OpenChain is based around the Specification, which is our industry standard for the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. All of our other activity is to support this, whether it's activity around reference material, training material policies, whether it's our online self-certification, or indeed our partner network who help with more formal or audited certification approaches. Everything here is about having a standard for open source compliance that will mean that the supply chain is easier to trust and that we could get greater efficiency, which of course saves resources. If you have questions, if you're brand new, don't hesitate. Mark is the master. He's guided this through an incredible process, and I believe over 150 contributors in the last 3 or 4 years. And on that note, Mark, if it's cool, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Shane. I have one quick question about the spec. Is there going to be a meeting in the in Europe at the conference?
Yes,
At the
absolutely.
end of the month?
Yes, there is an opportunity for a meeting. We've got a space for a workshop on the afternoon of the 29th. So currently, and this will be promoted heavily this week onwards, the automotive work group will meet, I believe, between 9 and 12 on the 29th of October in Lyon at Open Source Summit Europe. At 2 p.m., we'll have an OpenChain governing board meeting. And at 3:30 p.m., we've got an hour and a half window for a workshop where, for instance, if you want to take the time, you're very welcome to take the majority of that time to do the final walkthrough on the spec, because I believe that would be the absolute last chance for people to look at what we've got.
That's right. Thank you for that update. Yes, this is we're kind of near the end of this. I would call it a more lighter weight or minor revision. If people aren't familiar, the current version of the spec is, that we're going to, the next one is going to be very small clarification edits. And this is largely because we want to put this one in as our submission to the ISO organization. So if anybody has any feedback, that meeting at the end of the month will be the last opportunity for people to provide, again, what we would refer to as very minor edits. So at this point, we don't have any outstanding feedback to review. You still have an opportunity to get that to us if you have. What we will do is once we conclude this minor update, we will begin a more major revision and look at the spec, which will probably be another 12-month cycle, I'm guessing. But this one is more of a 7-month, 8-month cycle because of our need to keep it to keep the revisions very small. So at this point, again, we don't have any items to go over, but please feel free to either email the spec mailing list or go to our GitHub issues list, or you can email me directly if you want to keep yourself anonymous about the feedback you want to provide. So that's pretty much where we are with the spec. Any questions about that?
Yeah, it's Andrew here. So I've been through the spec as a result of updating the open source policy template, and so that was originally based on 2.0. So I've been looking at the sort of 2.1 of the spec alongside that, but also I've been doing recently a fair amount of work on ISOs as well. So I do actually have some proposals, but what I don't. First of all, I'm very cognizant of what you say about trying to keep the proposals minimal, and some of them are very, very minor. They're just typos, so I won't talk about those now. I'll just put them in the issues list. Some of them are potentially more significant, but do not specifically impinge upon the ISO application. So I'll put them in the issues list, and then if we want to park those for discussion further in the cycle after this particular release, then that's fine. But there are, however, a couple of issues that I think it would be worthwhile drawing out, and they're not major at all, but they are more specifically related to the ISO application. And I think that probably the two most significant ones of those are, first of all, the normative references clause, and I've been just thinking far too hard about normative references recently, but so apologies. We do make specific reference to the open source definition and the free software definition, and I think they should be included in there as normative references. So what I'll do in the issues list is I will add an issue just which highlights that. The other thing that I think is relevant is looking at the ISO guidance on how to draft a standard. It does repeat quite frequently the idea of trying to use non-jargon language, trying to use plain language where possible. And as a result, I'm still sort of slightly concerned about the use of terminology compliance artifacts. It does sound fairly stilted to me, and I'm wondering whether, given that we have changed the terminology of program participants already, whether we ought to look at something along the lines of license compliance materials or something that has a more natural meaning than compliance artifacts, which strikes me as being a little bit sort of jargon-esque.
Mm-hmm. I think those are great
Something
points.
exciting.
If anybody wants to make some comments on those points of feedback.
It does sound like some exciting topics. Not as serious as you might have been hoping for, given the teams that we spoke for those. That last one, at least, I think we talked about that for over a month.
I agree. I think I recall that we did discuss, and I think there was a proposal to change it to material, and it was discussed quite heavily a few months ago.
Well, there's two different things. I think there's what we consider to be the output of a program, a compliance program. Right now, we call them compliance artifacts. But then the spec itself, I think, Sammy, you might be referring to, is what we call verification materials.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what's being asked here is if we want to use simpler terms when we refer to the output of a compliance program. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So I'm proposing for that license compliance materials as part of the output of the program, and then of course we still have compliance verification materials, which are the materials that demonstrate that the program has been implemented and is being followed.
Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, if anybody has also more material changes to the spec, you can also add them to the issues list, which we would then also just move out to the next major revision. I'm not sure this change in terminology is something that we potentially can entertain in this minor revision. Maybe we should discuss that by the end of the month.
Yeah, I mean, my
but it is
concern
worthy
there
of
is
something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, as I say, normally I would propose that this is something that is moved to the next iteration, but my concern here is that there's a very specific requirement. I mean, the ISO documentation itself, it talks about plain language, and I'm not sure whether that complies with that. I mean, I'm happy for people to disagree with me.
No,
If
no,
they say,
okay,
let's
that's
leave
fine.
it as is. That's fine.
I think that's a worthy point to make in your issues comments, that this
Yeah,
might be
okay,
more
okay.
acceptable.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't propose, from my point of view, necessarily that we need to discuss these issues anymore now. I think probably it makes more sense for me to put them in the issues list, and then they're all in one place, and then we can determine whether they can be sort of dealt with at the next meeting or not.
That'd be great.
Yeah, will do. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Any other comments people want to make with respect to the spec and the current version? Or questions?
I just want to make a quick note that the ideal mental model here would be that anyone who's OpenChain 2 conformant will be conformant to the ISO spec without any changes. So the best framing will be that if we do make changes to, for instance, language like software staff to program participants because it was used interchangeably, that kind of thing fits well into it. Though any substantive change we'd need to discuss. It would definitely need to be voted by the steering committee. So one thing I'd say is, on the 29th when we've got our workshop, probably that's the opportune time to have a steering committee, which is open for everyone to sit in. And the steering committee has a formal voting process with the leads of the work teams, like Mark, and the platinum members each having one vote. Basically, that's where we could probably lock down the final parameter of what goes in from the issues and what doesn't. I just wanted to check, probably the most experienced person on the line regarding standardization is David Rudin. I just wanted to double check if you've got any insight you'd like to share on this, or if you think our general direction right now, our dialogue, is flowing in a way that you would expect.
No, I think we're on the right track. Are you referring specifically to the proposal about nomenclature?
Yeah.
I think drafting these specs is more art than science, and so I think there's always the goal to make it as human readable as possible. But my sense is also that every sector is different and has their own terminology, and I'm not sure. I think it's subject for a group discussion. I don't think we've strayed too far from that, but it's certainly worth discussion. But I don't think, I think those are more guidances than hard and fast rules that we need to think about.
I'm guessing that, Andrew, you'll be at OSS Europe, and Mark, you'll be there too. So, and I'm not sure, David, if you'll be at OSS Europe 29th of October.
I'm not currently planning on it, but that can change.
All right, got it.
I will be there, yeah.
Well, we'll be able to dig into this a little more. And just a flag for those who are new to the call, we do actually also have an ISO editor on retainer. So essentially, once we have a lockdown on the suggestions from our work team, once the steering committee has a look at it and they're happy with it, then we put it back to the ISO editor to essentially run through and make sure everything looks kosher before we go into the pass fast track. And just to reiterate, all of the issues that will be submitted are incredibly valuable, not just for this ISO submission, but for the fact we'll immediately begin drafting potential future spec right after we essentially lock this down. So all of the issues will be considered, and there will be changes implemented with respect to the future of the OpenChain spec, even if we don't include them in the first ISO submission. So everything is very important to have added.
Yeah, one thing we need to understand is how we can update once it becomes accepted by ISO. What's their process for updates? Because we have our own, and I think we need to probably consider additional process or how they would deal with that. Because I'm not sure how we always do our updates will be in line yet. It's not clear to me. So. Okay, that's all I think we have on the spec.
Sorry, Sammy, just one final point on the, and I'm not very familiar with ISO at all, so from my perspective, I just want to understand, once we've made a submission, is it just a yes or a no, or do we get then the opportunity if they come back with some feedback, some requested alterations? Do we know?
I'd have to defer to David on how that's likely to pan out. And, we might need to cover this on another call with Seth from Joint Development Foundation.
Sure. But let me just give you the high level without getting into the ISO jargon, which is very ISO-ish. But effectively what happens is we come in at the final stages of what's the usual ISO approval process, and it goes for balloting for national bodies across the world. So basically, every nation has a right to vote on it, effectively. And those votes come in as either yes with comments, no, or no with comments. And as long as we get the majority of national bodies, it becomes an ISO standard. It is considered a courtesy to, if it's yes with comments, it's considered a courtesy to respond to them, but it's not a requirement. And likewise, if you get no with comments, either if we don't pass at all, and we want to address those comments for the next round, but if we still pass and there's no votes with comments, again, it's courtesy to respond, but not required. So, and it specifically, what we have told them is, which is in line with other standards bodies, is that when we put our specs up for consideration, we are only accepting basically yes or no. We are not allowing any modifications by ISO during that process.
And the conceptual model here is that the standard is fully baked because it's an industry standard, it's accepted, and we're just formalizing it through the ISO process. Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrew. This has been some really good input. And this is it. Second last chance on a call for any comments. If there's none, we move on to the conformance work team. Okay, conformance it is. So when it comes to conformance, we've got self-certification at the center of the project. For those of you who are brand new, I'm going to show the self-certification web app, just very briefly. My purpose here is just to ensure you've got a heads up of essentially how our spec, which might sound a little bit intimidating in terms of reading a spec and becoming conformant, in practice how people have a series of yes-no questions to conform with the spec. So bear with me for a few seconds as I change my screen share. This is to set context for where we go next. And I move...
Maybe a slightly naive question, but as we move to ISO, does that change the ability for people to self-certify, or does that not affect it?
Great question, Wendy. The short answer is that it will not change the ability of people to self-certify, and access to the spec will not be gated. So, for example, there might be a version of the spec on the ISO website which may or may not require payment to download, but a perfectly equivalent version of the spec will always be freely available on our project website along with self-certification.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'm just going to pause very briefly. We've got a few new people here. I see Nathan has joined, and Mattia has joined, Carlo Piana has joined. So we've got some people dialing in from the US and Europe. Good to have you all here. Okay, so for people who are new, here's how the spec turns into yes-no questions. This is the work team, which is chaired by Miriam, who's on the call. And in essence, the spec is broken down into 6 pieces. Each piece has a series of yes-no questions. In some cases, it's, for instance, 8 questions here. And in some cases, it's much shorter. It's 3 questions for this section. If someone can answer yes to everything, they are OpenChain conformant. They are able to self-certify. They know they've got the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. If they answer no to a question, they know where to focus on process improvement. And when it comes to how you address this, when you're OpenChain conformant, you can choose to submit it and have it announced, or you can just save your answers for your own reference. And naturally, as you're filling this out, it's private. And a lot of companies are filling this out. They've got some areas marked no, some areas marked yes, and they're using OpenChain to help guide their internal improvement and to guide their own processes. That's completely private, and some companies just save their answers for their own reference. They don't submit to be announced as OpenChain conformant. The figures are about 50-50. Half of the companies are working on OpenChain conformance, and half of the companies are doing health check and process improvement without necessarily prioritizing an announcement of conformance. Okay, that was just some context, and I'm going to share my screen again, this time running back to our slides. Okay, so self-certification is at the heart of our project, and it will always be available, but people also want other options. And essentially there's 3 types of option. One option is self-certification. One option is some kind of independent compliance assessment, as with ISO 26262, functional safety. And the other option is to have third-party certification or audits. Now we're trying to put together a slide deck and or a document and or case studies about this, particularly because we have offerings in the market. Self-certification is there. Independent compliance assessments are provided by a lot of our partners, law firms, consultancies. And we've got third-party certifiers like TÜV-SÜD actually doing formal certification around OpenChain. Working on the slides, they were initiated by Nicole, and Marcel from PwC Germany has been working on this, trying to work through the options for language and the options for explaining what's happening. Now, this is a little bit redlined because some of the terminology proposed by Marcel deviates from where we were previously going with the terminology to explain the 3 options. But regardless, it's pretty important that we do have a clear way of explaining these options because our user companies are asking for them. Most companies are interested in self-certification, but larger companies quite frequently are interested in knowing their options for independent assessments and third-party certification. And before running through these slides a little, I just wanted to hand over to Miriam, and just check, if you've got any comments or notes at this point about how this is playing out due to market demand.
Sorry, I was just on mute. Sorry about that. No additional comments. I think you captured that quite well.
Alrighty. So what I wanted to do on this call, and thank you, Miriam, is just to run through the slides that Nicole and Marcel have brought us. And the reason for this is that these are very large companies with experience in independent compliance assessment and third-party certification. So they can help us with this dialogue, but at the same time, it's our project, and we should be essentially all free and encouraged to contribute to this slide deck and make sure the messaging fits what you need if you're a user company. So the situation is described, basically the three options. Challenges are being described about why people might not choose self-certification. And we're going to have to work on the terminology around this to make sure everyone's comfortable. But in essence, we're looking at differences between markets, differences between companies in how they'd self-certify and whether that would be applicable to their customers and the customers would be happy. And another thing being that self-certification itself might be perceived by certain entities in the supply chain, certain customers, as a potential conflict of interest due to self-reporting. Now, these might sound like negative takedowns of self-certification. They're not intended that way. They're rather intended to try to codify or explain why people might want options apart from self-certification. And just to reiterate, while this is primarily a slide deck thus far put together by two vendors, this conversation starts with user companies. In fact, third-party certification, OpenChain, was essentially created because Hitachi wanted to have a third-party certification, and they asked TUVSUD to create that for them. And Nicole, who's on the call, I think, and her team did this, and Hitachi became the first third-party certified entity in late last year, in Q4 last year. Okay, so when it comes to self-certification, it's a fairly obvious thing. People go through the questions, whether digitally, whether it's in a document. They essentially double check if they can confirm they've got everything in place. When it comes to independent compliance assessment, Nicole, I think that terminology is lifted direct from ISO 26262, is that right?
Yeah, actually it's called independent safety assessment there. So what we are talking about is compliance. So I made independent compliance assessment out of an independent safety assessment because it won't make sense to have it with safety.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the terminology there was chosen to align with what we see in ISO. Though Marcel suggests supported self-certification as an alternative because he felt that described more accurately, for example, what PwC would be doing. I redlined Marcel's thing, not to remove it from consideration, but rather to explain right now that we were using independent compliance assessment. We've talked about it on previous calls and previous emails. But we do need to think about supported self-certification as an option to explain this with greater clarity or not. So this is something we need to discuss, and we can discuss it on this call or not. But I do want to just run to the next point, which again has a terminology thing which we might need to address. So we've been using the term third-party certification. This is what, I believe, Nicole, this is what you've productized around OpenChain in terms of you issue a third-party certification.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And during the conversation adjacent to this, one thing that came up just in conversation from companies where they were talking about third-party audits. So essentially we have a situation with third-party certification in use. Third-party audit used not formally in the project, but in play between companies as they talk about this. And Marcel wanted to suggest we consider third-party confirmation. This is because of some of the approaches they've got in their office in PwC Germany with regards how they use the terminology certification. So this is another area we need to chew the fat on around what term we use, what term the project will adopt, and your insights into this will be super valuable. So also there's a process flow being created here, which shows self-certification, what we currently call independent compliance assessment, and what we currently call third-party certification or third-party audit. The idea here is to show companies their options and to make sure that there's great clarity in why you would choose one or the other. And that's it. That's what we've got on the nuts and bolts of this approach in these slides. And what I'd like to do right now, I think this is the first time we've had it on call, is to throw this open to you and to just see, when you're looking at the OpenChain standard, when you're looking at adopting it or explaining it, is this approach working for you? Now, this isn't about the terminology yet, but is this approach covering all the bases for you? Oh, by the way, for those new on the call, silence always means complete and utter agreement. All right. I'm assuming that this does...
Matthias here.
Oh, yes, sorry. Please go ahead.
Hello, sorry. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is already covered, but it's not exactly 100% transparent from the slide that they are showing. What we in Lifer are looking for is we would be going for the self-certification, and then would like to have a third-party certifier to look at and assess our self-certification and give us, an additional stamp of approval. So, as I said, I'm pretty sure that this is already covered by the process. It's just that I don't see it in this specific slide.
That's a really good point.
I would not be sure. Is it really? Because, so far we have the self-certification, which is exactly the self-certification, and then third party as an alternative to it. Meaning if somebody else is giving an expertise after having seen all the details and verified by himself, then it has a different meaning. But if we use someone to review the self-certification, I would suggest that this is something totally different and probably a third option, but don't know whether it's worth the effort.
It does sound different if you self-certify or if a third or a trusted third party looks at it. So this is why we would like to combine both. So first that you go through the self-certification because we're pretty confident we can self-certify. But later on, we would also like to have a trusted third party to confirm.
Yeah, hi, that's Nicole. What I see is I don't see a contradiction in self-certification and third-party certification. Even if you do the self-certification first, let's see, when you start the third-party certification process, just means that it most probably runs smoother because you have everything in place and the assessors don't need to, let's say, search or look very long for finding the artifacts they need to see. But it's one or the other. You can start with third-party and then go to self-certification. You can do just one or the other. It's doesn't matter about the process.
I agree. As I said, I'm pretty sure it's covered. It's just that I don't see this. And if this is a slide deck that we want to show to the outside world, I think it would make sense to also expressly mention that as an option. Although it's a combination of two things that already exist on the slide. It's just not.
For me, that would be just something like, then if you already have self-certification, that's kind of fast-track third-party certification process then.
I think it's a question also of how you procure all the information that you need for the third-party certification and what that is looking at. So if you're saying it's really just a review of everything that's covered in the self-certification already, then it's certainly nice to start with the self-certification, make sure you have all the information that you need. You can answer all the questions that are in there and, pull out whatever, artifacts need to be provided. And then someone else looks at it and reviews it, but also, the third-party certification could potentially go beyond it. And my understanding of the audit that's been set up so far is actually that it does go beyond what OpenChain is checking.
I think I agree with that approach. I mean, certainly what we're planning, as you know, within ARM, we self-certified last month, and certainly our intention is that we will be conducting a random audit of the various programs over the coming months to ensure that actually across the organization there is consistency. So I would see that as much more of an audit rather than yes, you certify a second time, because we already put the necessary policies and processes in place. And obviously, we ran with a number of groups to ensure that they're running okay, and then rolled out the process across the organization. And our intention is to run internal audits to verify that, yes, what we've certified is still followed across the organization. But I would see that as an audit rather than an additional certification.
Interesting note on that, Sammy. I think that it hits a point that, for instance, Toshiba, our board representative Kobayashi-san, has been vocal about this on several occasions. Toshiba's interested in, for instance, having third-party audits of other companies' self-certification, and they're looking at a web of trust where, hypothetically, Toshiba might look at what Sony's doing, and Sony would have a look at what Toyota's doing, and Toyota would have a look at what Toshiba's doing, and they'd say, oh yeah, you didn't miss something here. And this is a concept that might only fly in places like Japan, but it is something they brought up, and in that mental model, the third-party audit would be different from recertifying. It's it will be friends having a look at the compliance artifacts and lending each other a hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, we also, with us certainly we have a separate audit team that I want them to give me assurance that yes, actually the adoption is across the organization. That's why we're triggering these internal audits. But I would say, from an OpenChain perspective, yes, of course, if they come up with some findings, we'll rectify those straight away. But I would say, once we self-certified, we self-certified. I wouldn't then take an additional step and say, right, we have to self-certify again, or.
No, absolutely.
I would actually say it's more, if you look back at how the self-certification started out, I think this is exactly what that was always supposed to evolve into, because everyone agreed that self-certification was the way to go at the beginning. That's what we chose, and everyone always also said, this is going to become third-party certification, or audit, however you want to call it. At some point, and whoever wants to do that in addition is welcome to do it. It also gives the self-certification more credibility if that's how you go about it, I think.
You're absolutely right. I think we had these discussions, and also at the time we weren't sure whether they're going to be external third parties who might take interest in doing these certifications /audit.
Exactly.
I would agree with all of that, yeah.
It sounds like one takeaway might be to either split or more carefully explain third-party certification /audit.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, this is very useful because it's actually based on real world activities by real companies. So it's much more than theory. We're just trying to make sure that we explain what's happening clearly.
I think it also gives us another thing we should consider, because it also shows that you always need to clarify what the audit is actually looking at, or what the third-party certification is always looking at. Of course, for the self-certification, that's available online and everyone can review it anyway. But if you're just saying, well, I don't know, OpenChain third-party certified, it really doesn't tell you anything, because people could have gone about it with a very broad approach, actually looking into more, or they could have just taken the minimal, let's call it, although I don't find it a good word, approach to look at what OpenChain requires.
For those doing the third-party certification to expose parts of the process and the results to really make it an honorable thing, or?
Well, I suppose it depends on who's triggering the third-party audit. So, for example, if a customer of mine is triggering an audit saying, okay, you self-certified, and now we need to check that, yes, you are doing what you said you were doing, that is slightly different to we ourselves wanting to get a higher degree of independent confidence that we're following the process we set up.
Then probably we need to have an additional process for the audit, because planning and program setup and so will all be totally different from the third-party certification than from the audit.
Yeah, Jan, you bring up, I think, a very important point. What I'm also thinking about is there need to be some kind of assessment model or audit model that we need to follow, or let's say have at least a guideline what we intend to do there.
Well, it's interesting because I mean, when we spoke about third-party certification / audit, we said that these could be subtly two different things. It's sort of checking that you're in process, or it could be that actually I want you, the third party, to conduct this certification on my behalf. Which is why point 3 refers to certification / audit.
It really sounds like we need to break these out to make sure that there's clarity there, that people, don't get stuck there.
Yep. Because I would also imagine that the audit would be, again, as others mentioned, depends on who triggers the audit. It will also be much different depending on who triggers it. So, for example, if I look at somebody, our supplier, and I want a third-party audit from them, I would probably be interested in only a few of their products, not the whole line. For example, in theory, if I was looking at ARM, I would maybe not want to pay for an audit of everything ARM does. So a third-party audit would be different depending on who's triggering it, what they're interested in. Yeah. So I wouldn't equate third-party certification with a third-party audit, because the breadth and the content could be very different.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I'm going to do an initial run of breaking out those slides, and I'll throw that open for further comment on the next call. Alrighty, so awesome input there. It's really helpful because we do need to frame this stuff really clearly before we get through ISO, so everyone, when they arrive at the project, immediately feels comfortable and yeah, they know exactly what they can get. So I think that's it for our day, actually. Is there any other business?
Shane, this is Russ. I have a question.
Hey, yeah.
Regarding the upcoming workshop, so for anybody else in automotive, or at least automotive in North America, international travel budgets typically have dried up by the fourth quarter. So I won't be able to attend in person. Are there any remote participation options?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. There's going to be dial-in and screen share, actually using this channel. So
okay, great.
Yeah, we normally, well, we always, and this is something good. Thanks for bringing it up, Russ. For anyone and everyone who's new on the call, and there's quite a few new people, whether we have a face-to-face meeting or not, we always try to make sure that people can dial in. Our community is spread across several continents, and we try to ensure that people can access live anything we're doing. And in addition to this, we record audio and video wherever possible of the slide decks and discussions. So for example, on this call, I'm not only recording audio, I'm recording our slides. And I recorded, as people popped on and so on. So that we have a nice clean record that people can access in different time zones as well. So really good point there, Russ. And the information about the meetings and the dial-in will be pushed out this week in detail, and we will keep reiterating it multiple times to ensure that our broader community gets it on our main lists, our country lists, and so on. So if you're not... Sorry, go ahead.
Of course, the time zones might not be extremely convenient.
I know. We always have to pick a victim. So on this call at 9 a.m. Pacific, the victim is Asia. So it's now 2 a.m. here in Japan. And then we have...
No, I was talking about the face-to-face in France. So yeah.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. And the French meeting will be taking place in the morning, European time, which is nice for Japan and terrible for the Americas. Sorry, guys. But we do try to spread the pain. So we actually time our meetings across the world to let everyone have a good day or a great day, and everyone gets a bad day as well. But as we say,
I would see it as showing dedication,
It's a test.
Yes, exactly.
And on that note, with no other business, thank you for an excellent call. We covered a lot of stuff here that's really useful, and I know that when our friends across Asia wake up, this recording will be useful as well. I'm looking forward to seeing many of you on our third Monday call. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of you in Europe face-to-face. And that's it. Thank you all. Talk again in a couple of weeks, or at most 4 weeks.